Imagine the holiest place on earth, the Vatican, where cardinals kneel in prayer, where the Pope speaks for God. Behind those walls, cardinals rolling dice. The Pope himself at a gambling table betting away money meant for the poor. A teenage cardinal, not yet ordained, building a palace with winnings from a single night of cards. And in the streets of Rome, merchants betting on who will be the next Pope, while inside the conclave, cardinals' attendants slip them information to tip the odds. This isn't a scandal from some forgotten history. This is the Vatican, and it's darker than you ever imagined. In 1484, a teenage cardinal sat down at a card table in Rome. His name was Raffaele Riario. He was 16 years old. He had never been ordained as a priest. He held his position because his uncle was a powerful cardinal, and in Renaissance Italy, power was inherited, not earned. Across from him sat Francesco Cibo, the son of Pope Innocent VIII, the Pope's own child, seated at a gambling table playing cards for stakes that would have bankrupted most men in Rome. They played a game called frusi, the Renaissance equivalent of poker. Cards were dealt, wagers were made, and when the night ended, Riario had won 60,000 scudi. To understand what that meant, you have to understand the value of a scudo. A skilled laborer in Rome earned about 50 scudi a year. A cardinal's salary was around 4,000. 60,000 scudi was enough to build a palace, enough to buy a fortune, enough that the man who lost it went running to his father, the Pope, demanding justice. Francesco Cibo told Pope Innocent VIII that Riario had cheated. He demanded the money back. The Pope, bound by family loyalty, summoned Riario and asked him to return the winnings. Riario refused. He had won the money fairly. The cards had fallen where they fell. He told the Pope he had already spent it. And he had. He spent it on a palace, the Palazzo della Cancelleria. It still stands in Rome today. Pink stone quarried from the ancient Colosseum. Granite columns taken from a Roman theater. A building so magnificent that it became the envy of every cardinal in the city. The Vatican never spoke of how it was funded. They never explained why a teenage cardinal, barely old enough to understand the vows he had taken, suddenly had enough money to rival the wealth of noble families. They simply let the palace stand, a monument to corruption, hidden in plain sight. But Raffaele Riario was not the only cardinal with a taste for gambling, and he was not the only one who would leave a stain on the church. 60,000 scudi bought him a palace. But 30 years later, another man would sit at a gambling table in Rome, and his losses would be far, far greater. In 1513, a man named Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X. He was 37 years old. He had been a cardinal since the age of 13. He was the son of Lorenzo de' Medici, ruler of Florence, patron of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. He was raised on power, on art, on the belief that the church existed to serve his family. When he took the throne of St. Peter, he inherited a treasury filled with gold. His predecessor, Pope Julius II, had been a warrior pope. He had raised armies, built fortifications, waged wars. He left behind a full coffer and a church that, for a brief moment, was financially stable. Leo X spent it all in 2 years. He spent it on art, on music, on lavish banquets that lasted until dawn, on hunts that tore through the Roman countryside, and on gambling. He was a compulsive gambler. He sat at card tables deep into the night, betting fortunes on single hands. He played dice with cardinals in rooms where the walls were painted by Raphael. He lost. He won. He lost again. And every time he lost, the treasury grew emptier. By 1515, the Vatican was bankrupt. Leo X had squandered a fortune that could have fed the poor of Rome for generations. But the church still needed money. The Vatican still had to function. Cardinals still expected their salaries. Builders still needed to be paid for the ongoing construction of St. Peter's Basilica. So Leo X did what popes before him had done. He found a new way to raise money. He sold indulgences. An indulgence was a certificate. It promised the buyer that their sins would be forgiven. Not just their own sins, the sins of their dead relatives, trapped in purgatory, waiting for enough prayers to be released. The church taught that purgatory was a place of fire, of suffering, of torment that could last for centuries. And Leo X offered a way out. For money. He hired a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel to sell them across Germany. Tetzel was a salesman. He was loud. He was theatrical. He rode into towns on a donkey, carrying a red velvet box containing the papal decree. He stood in market squares and preached, and he had a slogan. It rhymed. It was simple. It was devastating. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. People paid. They paid in coins. They paid in grain. They paid in livestock. They sold what little they had to buy their dead grandmothers out of hell. And the money flowed back to Rome, back to Leo X, back to the gambling tables. But in a small university town called Wittenberg, there was a monk who had been watching. His name was Martin Luther. He was a theologian. He was devout. He believed in the church with a fierceness that bordered on obsession. And he saw what was happening. He saw poor families handing over their last coins. He saw a pope who had gambled away the church's treasury, now selling salvation like a market vendor selling vegetables. He saw corruption so naked, so brazen, that he could not look away. On October 31st, 1517, Luther wrote a letter. He attached 95 arguments against the sale of indulgences. He nailed it to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. It was a common way to start an academic debate. He expected other scholars to respond. He expected the church to listen. They did not listen. They called him a heretic. They demanded he recant. They threatened him with excommunication. And Luther, instead of backing down, kept writing. He wrote pamphlets. They spread across Germany. They were printed on new machines called printing presses, and they moved faster than the church could stop them. Within a year, all of Europe was arguing about indulgences. Within 3 years, Luther had been excommunicated. Within 5 years, he had started a movement that would tear Christianity in half, the Reformation, a schism that shattered 1,000 years of unity. Catholics against Protestants, princes against popes, wars that would rage for generations. The 30 Years' War alone killed 8 million people. 8 million. Because a pope needed money to gamble. Pope Leo X did not live to see the full destruction. He died in 1521. He was 45 years old. His death was sudden. Some said it was poison. Others said it was the weight of what he had unleashed. When he died, the Vatican treasury was so empty that they had to reuse candles from a cardinal's funeral to light his own. Rome mocked him. They carved cartoons of him in the streets. They said he came in like a fox, lived like a lion, and died like a dog. But the damage was done. The church would never be whole again. And all of it, traced back to a card table, to a pope who could not stop gambling, to a Vatican that sold forgiveness to cover its debts. And yet, even as the Reformation burned across Europe, the gambling inside the Vatican did not stop. It only got darker. While cardinals prayed inside the Sistine Chapel, something else was happening in the streets of Rome. Men in velvet doublets sat in banking houses on the Banchi, the city's financial district. They held ledgers, they held quills, and they held bets. For centuries, Romans had gambled on the election of the next pope. It was not a secret. It was not hidden. It was a market. Bankers set odds. Merchants placed wagers. The common people gathered in piazzas, arguing over which cardinal had the most votes, which faction was rising, which candidate had just lost favor with the Spanish king. By the time a conclave began, the betting markets had already decided the frontrunners. They called them the papabili, the possible ones. Their names were whispered in the streets. Their odds were chalked on boards outside the banking houses. Tens of thousands of crowns changed hands on the outcome of a vote that was supposed to be guided by the Holy Spirit. But in 1549, something happened that took the markets from scandalous to criminal. A conclave convened to elect the successor of Pope Paul III. The cardinals locked themselves behind the bronze doors of the Sistine Chapel. They took oaths of secrecy. They swore they would not communicate with the outside world until a pope was chosen. They were supposed to be alone with God. They were not alone. Outside the walls, the betting houses were running their markets as usual. But this time, the odds did not shift slowly. They shifted with precision. They moved exactly as the votes moved inside. Bankers in Rome knew the state of the poll before the cardinals had even counted the ballots. A Venetian envoy named Enrico Dandolo was in Rome during the conclave. He watched the betting markets closely. He wrote letters back to Venice describing what he saw. And what he saw, he could not explain. Until he discovered the truth. The cardinals' attendants, the men who brought them food, who carried messages, who cleaned their chambers, were slipping out of the conclave at night. They were going to the banking houses. They were telling the bookmakers exactly how many votes each cardinal had received. They were partners in the wagers. Dandolo wrote it plainly. It is more than clear that the merchants are very well informed about the state of the poll, he said. The cardinals' attendants in conclave go partners with them in wagers, which thus causes many tens of thousands of crowns to change hands. This was not gambling. This was insider trading. The men who were supposed to be guiding the church were leaking information to bookmakers, who were profiting from the election of God's representative on earth. The conclave of 1549 to 1550 lasted 4 months. It was one of the longest in history. The cardinals were divided. Factions clashed. The Spanish king pressured them. The French king threatened them. But through all of it, the betting markets churned, and the attendants kept feeding them information. When Cardinal Giovanni Maria Ciocci del Monte was finally elected Pope Julius III, the bookmakers had known his victory was coming days before the white smoke rose. They had already cashed out their winners. They had already collected their losses. The system was corrupt from the inside out. The Vatican knew. They had to know. The betting markets were too visible, too loud, too public to miss. In 1591, Pope Gregory XIV tried to stop it. He issued a decree. Anyone who bet on a papal election would be excommunicated, cut off from the church, damned for eternity. It did not work. The markets continued. They moved underground. The stakes got higher. The information got more precise. By the 17th century, betting on papal elections was so entrenched that cardinals themselves were rumored to be placing wagers on their own elections, on the elevation of their rivals, on the death of the Pope who sat on the throne. This was not a vice of the common people. This was a corruption that reached the highest levels of the church, and it did not stop. In the 20th century, bookmakers in London and New York still took bets on papal conclaves. When Pope John Paul II died in 2005, the odds boards lit up. Paddy Power, the Irish bookmaker, posted odds on every cardinal who had a chance. Joseph Ratzinger was the favorite. He became Pope Benedict XVI. The bookmakers paid out. When Benedict resigned in 2013, the markets exploded again. Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio was not the favorite. He was not even in the top 5. But the bookmakers who took bets on him at long odds made fortunes when he took the name Francis. The Vatican condemned it. They called it disrespectful. They called it a violation of the sacred. But they never stopped it. Because stopping it would mean admitting how long it had been happening, how deep the corruption went, how the men inside the conclave, the men who were supposed to be listening for the voice of God, had been tipping off bookmakers for 500 years. The Vatican's secret casino never closed. It just moved underground. The tables are gone, the dice are silent, but the betting continues. Because some things, once corrupted, cannot be made pure again. The palace still stands. The bookmakers still take bets. And somewhere in the Vatican archives, there are records they don't want you to see. Records of cardinals who lost everything. Records of a pope who gambled away the church. Records of a system so corrupt that it turned the election of God's representative on earth into a gambling market. They don't teach this history. They don't want you to know. But the stones of Rome remember. They remember the teenage cardinal who built a palace with a knight of cards. They remember the pope whose gambling debts shattered Christendom. They remember the bookmakers who knew the name of the next pope before the smoke even rose. And now, so do you. The Vatican's secret casino is not a story about gambling. It is a story about power, about men who wore the robes of holiness while playing dice with the souls of the faithful, about a church that sold forgiveness to cover its debts and called it divine will, about a system that has never fully been held accountable. The palace is still there, the betting still happens, and the question that lingers, the question the Vatican has never answered, is this: if they were willing to gamble with the treasury, with the Reformation, with the election of the Pope himself, What else were they willing to gamble with?